Hi, VencoreWeather.com meteorologist Paul Dorian here. Well, we're approaching the latter part of April. Time once again to take a look at the tropical outlook for the Atlantic Basin. Over the next several minutes, we'll also take a look at the Mid-Atlantic summertime outlook. Whenever dealing with longer range forecasts, as we are in this case, I like to take a look first at oceanic cycles. Sea surface temperature anomalies are critical whenever dealing with longer range weather forecasting. We'll focus in on not only the Atlantic Ocean sea surface temperature anomalies, but also in the Pacific Ocean. One of the main factors that will play a role in the Atlantic Basin tropical season is the fact that El Nino in the tropical Pacific is actually undergoing a rapid collapse. All indications are that it will evolve into first neutral conditions and then colder than normal La Nina conditions by the latter part of the tropical season. Keep in mind the tropical season here in the Atlantic Basin continues right into October, perhaps even November, generally peaks during the month of September. So indeed, by that point of the year, it looks like we could have colder than normal conditions setting up in the equatorial position. Right now, there still are warmer than normal waters, but it's much weaker than it was just a few months ago. And again, all indications are that La Nina will take over by the latter part of this year. Well, we are going to walk through the actual posting that's on the website right now, the VencoreWeather.com website, and we'll just progress right through that posting so you can easily follow along here by looking at the posting. First, the highlights. I expect a hot and dry summer in the Mid-Atlantic region. We also will focus in on some analog years. Went back over the last 50, 60, 70 years or so to find some years that have somewhat similar conditions to this particular year, specifically those years that featured an El Nino that transitioned pretty rapidly to a La Nina. Certainly no two years are exactly alike, but we found 6 years that believe are pretty analogous to this particular year. Now, by going back and looking to see what happened in those years gives us some idea as to what we could expect for the upcoming tropical season and the Mid-Atlantic summertime season. Again, we talked about the major factors, specifically oceanic temperatures, not only in the Pacific Ocean, but in the Atlantic Ocean as well, and we'll focus in on all of that over the next several minutes. Well, let's start off by looking at the sea surface temperature anomalies. Earlier this year, this is back in the early part of January, about 3.5 months ago, a few areas of interest I want to focus in on. First of all, here is the strong El Nino as we moved into 2016, indicated on this particular anomaly chart with orange and yellows. Warmer than normal sea surface temperatures throughout the equatorial part of the Pacific Ocean. This is the west coast of South America. During the latter part of 2015, this El Nino strengthened dramatically, probably peaked during December of 2015 as one of the strongest in the last 50 or 60 years or so, rivaling those strong El Ninos of 97, 98, 82, 83. Typically, we have a very strong El Nino perhaps once a decade or so. We've had this one in 2015 going into 2016 this year. We didn't really have a very strong El Nino last decade, but we had 2 or 3 moderately strong El Ninos. Then we had, before that, a strong El Nino 97, 98, 82, 83, 72, 73. This particular El Nino, again, peaked in December and is undergoing a rapid collapse as we speak. Well, a couple other areas of interest I want to point out. Again, we're looking at the sea surface temperature anomalies from early January. Notice the region from the west coast of Africa, which is right here, all the way across the Caribbean Sea to the Gulf of Mexico. Basically, this region right in here, generally dominated by warmer than normal conditions, as represented again by the yellows and oranges. Throughout the Gulf of Mexico, most of the Caribbean Sea, and in this breeding ground region of the tropical Atlantic, including the just off the west coast of Africa. Typically, for our tropical season, we have waves that push off the west coast of Africa, especially during the first half of the tropical season. This is the main pattern of activity. Tropical waves push from east to west from the west coast of Africa, riding along with those trade winds, moving out over the warm waters of the tropical Atlantic, and then either recurving over the Atlantic or heading towards the Caribbean Sea, the Gulf of Mexico, or perhaps even making landfall in the U.S. Typically, a sea surface temperature of 80 degrees is required for the formation of tropical storms. So a focus on where it's colder than normal is critical here. And again, in this particular region, the breeding ground region for tropical systems in the Atlantic Basin, earlier this year it was almost universally above normal, a bullish sign for tropical storm formation or tropical storm intensification when a storm already has formed. Well, let's now progress to the very latest sea surface temperature anomaly chart. Several things to point out here. First of all, there are still warmer than normal conditions here in the equatorial part of the Pacific Ocean, but it's a much weakened state compared to just 3.5 months ago in early January. And again, many computer forecast models indicate this will evolve into neutral conditions over the next couple of months, and then La Nina conditions by the latter part of this year, the latter part of the tropical season, which tends to peak around September or October. We'll look at those computer model forecasts in a moment, by the way. Notice also across the Atlantic Basin, a little area here of colder than normal water just off the west coast of Africa. Also, some colder than normal pockets showing up here just off the southeast coast and across the western Gulf of Mexico. These are important areas to monitor because, again, colder than normal conditions can be an inhibiting factor to tropical storm formation. Notice also this large blob of colder than normal water in the North Atlantic. It expanded southward since the early part of January. So these pockets of colder than normal water are negative signs for tropical storm formation. However, on the other hand, and there's usually another hand whenever you're dealing with long-range weather forecasting, notice this large extent of warmer than normal waters from the interior part of the Gulf of Mexico across the Caribbean Sea throughout much of the tropical Atlantic region, still above normal. So somewhat mixed signals coming from the Atlantic basin. Some pockets of colder than normal, but still a pretty large area of above normal. Meanwhile, the fact that El Nino is weakening is a bullish sign, believe it or not, for tropical storm formation in the Atlantic, because during strong El Nino years, or really any kind of El Nino years, you tend to have stronger than normal westerly winds in the tropical Atlantic. That is extra wind shear that tends to inhibit tropical storm formation or reduce the chance for a tropical storm that has already formed to evolve into a strong hurricane. So the fact that the El Nino is undergoing a rapid collapse and is likely to evolve into La Nina by the middle or latter part of the tropical season is a bullish sign for tropical storm formation, because we will lose that beneficial effect of stronger than normal westerly winds in the upper part of the atmosphere in the Atlantic Basin. Well, we talked a moment ago about almost a universal agreement now with many computer forecast models that predict this El Nino will continue to collapse over the next couple of months, first evolve into neutral conditions in the tropical Pacific, and then colder than normal conditions by the latter part of this year, the latter part of the tropical season, which again can continue into October or November in the Atlantic Basin. This is a map that shows the many dynamical or statistical computer models that predict where we stand right now up in this region right here will drop rapidly over the next couple of months. This is the neutral line, cuts across right here, and by the time we get to the latter part of the second half of the year here, like August, September, October right here, or September, October, November, most computer models have us below this neutral line. This is La Nina down in this region right here, and El Nino up above that neutral line. By the second half of the year, we are predominantly predicted to be down in this region right here. That is an important premise I'm using for the forecast for a slightly above normal, a more active tropical season, especially compared to last year when El Nino dominated And again, as we talked a minute or two ago, with El Nino comes enhanced vertical wind shear, which is an inhibiting factor for tropical storms in the Atlantic Basin. But the almost universal agreement here that by the latter part of the year we will have La Nina conditions, and that is a bullish sign for tropical storm formation. By the way, most models agree that we'll have a pretty moderate to strong La Nina by the end of this year. Some models even have way down here almost record type La Nina conditions by the latter part of the year, 2 to 3 degrees Celsius colder than normal in the equatorial part of the Pacific Ocean. Not only will La Nina later this year have an impact on the Atlantic tropical season, but by the end of the year and next year, and perhaps even in 2018, if a strong La Nina indeed does get established in the tropical Pacific, it'll have ramifications on things like global temperatures, which should drop sharply once La Nina becomes established in the tropical part of the Pacific Ocean. Well, again, one of the main things to do whenever dealing with long-range weather forecasting is to look at oceanic cycles, sea surface temperature anomalies. Another useful tool is to look at analog years. Try to find years that have somewhat similar conditions to the expectations for this year. Specifically, I went back 50, 60, 70 years to find those particular years that had El Niños transitioning to La Niñas in a fairly rapid fashion, and found 6 particular years that are listed right here. And by looking at what kind of weather conditions occurred in those analog years, can give you some idea of what to expect in this particular upcoming summer and this particular upcoming tropical season. Well, in these analog years, we not only had warmer than normal conditions in the Mid-Atlantic region, as indicated on this map by the yellows and oranges and reds, but pretty much the bulk of the U.S. featured a warm, above normal, hotter than normal summer. This is an average for the June, July, and August, an average for these particular 6 analog years that I have chosen that are listed right here. So this leads me to believe that we will have hotter than normal conditions in the June, July, August period, perhaps 1, 2, or even 3 degrees above normal, averaging over the June, July, August period in the Mid-Atlantic region. Well, what about precipitation? Well, looking again at these analog years, the average for June, July, and August, again, lots of yellows and oranges, which on this particular map means below normal precipitation amounts. And I'm leaning towards hot and dry conditions with below normal rainfall in the June, July, August time period for the Mid-Atlantic region. For these analog years, it averaged out to a dry summer from the Mid-Atlantic region all the way down into the southeast U.S., again indicated here by the yellows and oranges and reds, perhaps 2, 3, or 4 inches below normal for the June, July, and August time period. Now, this may seem a little counterintuitive relative to the fact that I expect a slightly above normal tropical season. We often get beneficial rainfall here in the latter part of the summer from the remnants of tropical systems, but we'll see in a moment here that during these analog years, many of the tropical systems that do form do not actually reach the Mid-Atlantic region. They focus instead on either recurving over the Atlantic Ocean or have an impact on the southeast U.S., the Gulf of Mexico, or the Caribbean Sea. So even though I expect a slightly above normal tropical season, I do not expect we'll get many beneficial rainfalls in the August time period. Perhaps later in the fall we will, but in the June, July, August time period, probably not a lot of beneficial rainfall from the remnants of tropical systems based on analog years. Well, how do those analog years, again, these 6 analog years that I think are pretty similar to this particular season, how do the hurricane total tally here for these particular individual seasons? We have that listed here. The total number of storms, these are named systems, the total number of hurricanes that reached a Category 1, and the total number of majors, which is a Category 3, 4, or 5, averaged out to some 14 total named storms, 7.6 hurricanes, and 3.6 majors. This is slightly above normal, again, leading me to believe we will have a slightly above normal season with perhaps around 14 or so total named storms, 7 or so of which will become hurricane level, and 3 or 4 that could reach major hurricane status. That is a category 3, 4, or 5. So again, this is all based on analog forecasting for those years that had El Nino transitioning to La Nina. Well, we talked about the storm tracks a moment ago, the fact that during these analog years, many of the storms did not actually reach the Mid-Atlantic region. These are 4 of the 6 years, and then we'll look at the last 2 years, 1954, 1964, 1988, and 98. And all the storm tracks are shown here for these individual years. And notice the Mid-Atlantic region, kind of few and far between in terms of storms actually tracking up this far north. Most of the activity stays across the southeast U.S., Gulf of Mexico, Caribbean, or they recurve and stay out to sea. Again, in all these years, there's plenty of activity down in the southeast U.S., the Gulf of Mexico, Caribbean Sea, and out over the Atlantic, and not all that much activity in the Mid-Atlantic region. So this is an indication that we may not get a lot of beneficial rains from the remnants of tropical systems during the June, July, and August time frame. Again, maybe in the fall that'll change somewhat, but as far as the summertime conditions, I'm leaning towards not only hotter than normal, but drier than normal, despite the fact that the tropical activity in the Atlantic Basin could be above normal, or at least slightly above normal. Now, I do not expect a mega year, the kind of a year, for example, that occurred in 2005, where it was a record-breaking year in the Atlantic Basin. Just too many cold pockets of water in the Atlantic Ocean, in my opinion, to see a mega year. We will be slightly above normal, perhaps, and that may be a noticeable increase compared to the last couple of years, which were generally quiet years. In fact, we've had a long stretch here in the U.S., perhaps a record-breaking stretch, amazing fashion here, that we have not seen a major hurricane hit the U.S. since 2005, specifically Hurricane Wilma in the latter part of October of 2005 struck southwestern Florida as a major hurricane, and that was the last major hurricane, 3, 4, or 5, that hit the U.S. Even more amazing, perhaps, is the fact that the state of Florida has not seen a hurricane of any intensity level in more than 10 years. Both of these streaks are amazing. More than 10 years. Both of these streaks are perhaps record-breaking in the record-keeping era, and they are somewhat in jeopardy this year, again, since we expect a slightly above normal season. But let's hope these streaks can continue. Let's now take a look at the final 2 analog years for the storm tracks. Well, again, just like those previous 4 years, 2007, 2010 featured lots of storms that recurved out over the Atlantic, and lots of activity in the Gulf of Mexico, Caribbean, southeastern part of the U.S., and not much activity up across the Mid-Atlantic region. So again, this is a reason to believe that we will not have substantial beneficial effect from the remains of tropical systems in terms of rainfall during the latter part of the summer. Again, we'll determine the fall later on this year, but for the most part, it looks like the main impact, based on analog years, by the hurricanes or the tropical storms in the Atlantic Basin this summer may be across the Gulf of Mexico, southeast U.S., Caribbean Sea, or those storm tracks may stay out to sea and recurve before they ever affect the U.S. mainland. Well, let's wrap up this video discussion by going back to the beginning here, where we showed the highlights and the major factors. Again, based on analog years and based on the premise that El Nino will transition first to neutral conditions over the next couple of months, and then La Nina by later this year, later this tropical season, it looks like we may have a hot and dry summer in the Mid-Atlantic region. There may be a slightly above normal tropical season in the Atlantic Basin. We'll, of course, continue to monitor all of these factors over the next couple of months. For example, that area of colder than normal water in the north Atlantic. If indeed that continues to expand to the south, that could have an inhibiting effect on tropical storms, and if that continues to occur, if that trend continues, that could change the outlook, and we'll monitor that over the next couple of months. Any kind of colder than normal conditions up in the North Atlantic could increase the chances for high pressure to set up in that part of the Atlantic Ocean, which in turn can be an inhibiting factor, can push some cooler waters into the tropical Atlantic. So we'll monitor that possibility over the next several weeks. But for right now, this is the outlook for the Atlantic Basin tropical season and the Mid-Atlantic summertime conditions here as presented by Vencore Weather. Stay tuned to VencoreWeather.com over the next couple of months for any changes. That's it for now. I'm VencoreWeather.com meteorologist Paul Dorian.